Hi, my name is Lydia Buck, and this is my mini lecture for my interest inquiry assignment for History and Systems of Psychology. And I will be presenting on the history of psychology. Psychology is a fairly young science. It did not exist until the 19th century when it was in fact invented as a study. Prior to psychology, the focus lied in the areas of philosophy and physiology. And often the founders of psychology are credited to being two men in the 19th century named Wilhelm Wundt and William James. Wilhelm Wundt was a German scientist, and he was the first person to be given the title of psychologist. He published his first book, Principles of Physiological Psychology, in 1873. He viewed psychology as the study of the conscious experience and focused on understanding the structural pieces and characteristics of the mind. And this was how he founded the idea of structuralism. He felt that psychology was meant to identify the parts of consciousness and how they were intertwined to create our conscious experience. He looked at these conscious experiences utilizing what we now call it introspection, and he referred to it as internal perception, when one examines their own experience as objectively as possible. And he felt that in order to study these objective experiences, it required specific experimental conditions, which included the use of practice and trained observers that observed and reported reaction, and the use of repeatable stimuli. However, his idea of structuralism fell out of popularity because it was seen as subjective. William James was an American psychologist, and he was the first to push for an opposing view of how psychology should function. James embraced Darwin's theory of evolution, and he was the founder of functionalism. And functionalism stated that psychology is meant to study the function of behavior in the world and focused on the operation of the whole mind rather than pieces of conscious experience, and also focused on how mental functions allow organisms to perform in their environments. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist, and he was interested in patients who were afflicted by neurosis and hysteria. Hysteria was an ancient diagnosis for disorders without an apparent physical cause, and they were primarily seen in women and included both emotional disturbances and physical symptoms. Freud theorized many patient issues resulted from the unconscious mind and saw the unconscious mind as a source for human urges and feelings that we are unaware of. He felt that dreams could provide insight into the unconscious and provided the first method for dream analysis in his interpretation of dreams. And Freud primarily focused on psychoanalytic theory, looking at the role of one's unconscious mind and childhood experiences, and he also popularized the method of psychoanalysis, which we still use today. Kurt Kafka, Max Wertheimer, and Wolfgang Kohler were all German psychologists who fled to the US to escape Nazi Germany. And they brought forward Gestalt principles. Gestalt loosely translates to mean whole. And they introduced these Gestalt ideologies to psychologists in the US. And Gestalt psychology focused on the pieces of a sensory experience and how those pieces relate to one another as a whole. The way in which Gestalt psychology focused on the whole contradicts the pieces that Wundt focused on in his structuralism perspective. But the perspective of Gestalt psychology provided the foundation for the development of humanism. But Gestalt psychology was quickly overshadowed by the growth of behaviorism. Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner are very influential behaviorists. Pavlov studied learned behaviors through classical conditioning. He was a Russian physiologist, and he is famous for his work with conditioning through the use of dogs, in which he studied conditioning dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell without the presence of food. Watson, an American psychologist, felt that the objective analysis of the mind was an impossible feat, and he focused on observable behavior and would attempt to get that behavior under control. And behaviorism is mostly responsible for establishing psychology as a scientific discipline. And then Skinner, he was also an American psychologist, and he focused on how behavior could be influenced by its consequences, and that reinforcement and punishment were major driving factors in human behavior. Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. They are very influential humanists. They're both American psychologists and focused on the natural predisposition for good in humans, their intentionality and personal control, which led to the development of humanism, which focuses on a human's natural potential for good and predisposition for good that should be innate in all humans. Maslow proposed a hierarchy of human needs, which stated that if basic survival needs are met, then human behavior will be motivated by higher level needs. And then Rogers focused on the use of client-centered therapy, which is different than psychoanalytic theory, which has the patient take on the lead role in the session. And Rogers said that 3 characteristics are needed in order to ensure the effectiveness of client-centered therapy. And those 3 characteristics were empathy, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard. Let's see. Unconditional positive regard was in reference to the fact that therapists accept their patients as they are, no matter what they say. And then Ulrich Neisser and Noam Chomsky are key figures in the cognitive revolution. Neisser published the first textbook, Cognitive Psychology, in 1967, which became the main text for cognitive psychology courses throughout the country. And while there's no one person that's seen as the founder of cognitive psychology or the cognitive revolution, Chomsky was a very influential figure in the revolution. He was an American linguist who felt that mental functioning could not be overlooked in the study of psychology because at the time behaviorism was the main focus. And then I found a very fun YouTube video that kind of goes over the same key people that I mentioned in the video in my slides. I think it's only about like 2 to 3 minutes long. And then my reference page. I used our textbook, an online textbook, and I included the source for my YouTube video as well.